Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. Welcome, Bookends, to another instalment in our debut Spotlight series, where we shine a light on the freshest authors and their work. Today we have the absolute pleasure of sharing the airwaves with debut novelist Sarah Marsh to talk all about her book, A Sign of Her Own, an empowering story of a young woman's journey to accepting her deaf identity, exploring the hidden history of the deaf community, and finding your own authentic voice.
Sarah Marsh is a writer based in London. She was shortlisted for the Lucy Cavendish Prize in 2019 and was selected for the London Library Emerging Writers Programme in 2020. Her debut novel, A Sign of Her Own, is out now and published by Tinder Press. We are so happy to have Sarah here today. Welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And so, Sarah, we always love to start our podcast by asking our favourite question, which is, what are you currently reading?
Well, I just finished Pod by Lailene Paul, which I loved it. I really enjoyed it, but I was particularly fascinated by how she created the whole sort of acoustic world of the ocean, which was very interesting.
I really want to read that. I think you've got it, haven't you, Lydia?
I have, yeah, because it was nominated for the Women's Fiction Prize last year. So really excited about it. And it's one of those ones that I keep meaning to get to, but I haven't yet.
It's really brilliant.
I'm excited. So we like to start our debut Spotlight episodes by asking authors what their experience has been like in having their debut published. Could you tell us about what your experience has been like?
Yeah, I think on the whole it's been an amazing experience, but it's definitely up and down. I think there's long spells in which not much happens, and then suddenly lots of things happening, and then it's a bit quiet again. I did a lot of structural edits after getting a book deal, so it was really interesting to be sort of deep back in that process again, but knowing that this really is the final thing you're creating. And then there's this sort of transformation process of the book becoming an object, with the jacket cover, which, you know, is amazing to see. And we changed the title of the book, and that was interesting, sort of while I was sort of doing the editing and sort of really distilling what the sort of the essence of the book is and coming up with that title. But yeah, I'm not sure anything gets you ready really for the reality of it going out there and sort of people reading it. And I think it's wonderful hearing people's reactions, but I think I'm still learning to think of the book as something separate from myself, which I think you do have to do. So yeah, that's where I am now.
Absolutely. And I saw on Twitter last night the display at Goldsborough Books, and it was beautiful. How did that feel?
Yeah, I mean, that was completely overwhelming when you turn up and there's not just one, but many copies of your book in the window. And my kids were there as well, so they were very impressed. It was very overwhelming. It was a great night, but I really enjoyed sort of that first moment of it, you know, really going out in the world.
That's incredible.
Fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. Now, we both love the book, so we'd love to start talking about that. My first question really is about one of the characters in the book. So many of us are familiar with Alexander Graham Bell and the invention of the telephone, but I was not aware at all of his work with deaf people. You write this character so vividly. What was it like researching and bringing him back to life?
So I read lots. I mean, I started writing the story. I started writing about Belle because I'd sort of grown up deaf myself, and so I came across this perspective. But you're right, not many people know about it, and was shocked and fascinated. But it sort of isn't more known about. So I started looking at all the biographies of Belle, and sort of the story was starting to form. But I was interested in the period of his life when he was quite young. He's in his late 20s. He's not yet famous, but he's already somebody. He's a very sort of commanding figure, quite hot-headed and excitable and extremely ambitious. And so I wanted to get his character, but I think what really mattered to me was the relationship he had with his deaf pupils, because his ideas about deaf education became very influential. He campaigned strongly for oralism, the movement of oralism. And so I was really interested in what his students felt about him. And I think because I think deaf and disabled people can often take on the narratives that society creates for them, and especially at that time in the late 19th century. So I was interested in the kind of sway he might have over them, his pupils, and how they could sort of break free from that. So for me, it was about getting that relationship, and I needed the relationship to feel complex and fully dimensional, so that so that was really the focus. But I think it's interesting writing about someone so famous because so much else had been written about him. So I felt freer to be able to take that sort of view of his students because that's the one account that we don't have.
Yeah, you could tell it was very well researched, and as Lydia said, it was so great to read about, or maybe not so great to read about the work that he did with deaf people, but very interesting and a great learning experience. And I also think that this book gives an incredible insight to hearing readers about the ways in which deaf and hard of hearing people have to navigate daily interactions with hearing people. I felt particularly struck by the first conversation that we witness Ellen have with her fiance and Mr. Bell, and how she tries to figure out the atmosphere in the room, the shame she feels when she misunderstands the words they're using, the tension, waiting for a fiance to write down what was being said. Why was it important to you to represent these details in communication?
So I think often for deaf people, I mean, communication is an issue that comes up time and time and time again. And it's a practical issue because it's one that you have to, deal with. It's a constant barrier, and you have to ask people to repeat themselves. You have to plan for every meeting and appointment, sort of an interpreter or getting the captions to work. Or you have to, or finding captions showing at the theatre and booking the access seat. So there's always so much extra work and planning. And I think there tends to be this emphasis on, deaf people not understanding, but actually I think deaf people are really good at adapting their communication, and we're always having to work hard to get our access needs met. So I mean, it's a burden in a way, but it's also a source of resourcefulness. But I think I really wanted to capture that, through the detail you mentioned in the novel as an aspect of the experience, but for readers to hopefully really appreciate that aspect as well.
I definitely appreciated it, and it gave me such a bigger understanding of what that experience is like because you wrote it in such a visceral way.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that bit.
Definitely. And you mentioned there a little bit about going, when you go to the cinema and you need to find out captions and whatnot. We have noticed an upsurge in the amount of films, TV, and other media that have highlighted deafness, and that's also the prospect of there's also the prospects of British Sign Language being introduced as a GCSE. I think it's in like 2025. What do you think Ellen would think of the experiences of modern members of the deaf community?
I think, I think it's great news about the BSL GCSE, and it's another example of just really the hard campaigning that the deaf community has done for, BSL to, be recognised as language and included. And deaf representation in mainstream media is starting to improve, like you said, yes, with those Ailing Ellis, we saw Tasha Stone in Great British Bake Off, and some of the films coming out at the moment. And Ellen is the main character in the book, and I think she's one of Bell's deaf pupils, and I think she would be pleased to see that so many deaf people are openly proud of being deaf and feel it's part of their identity. I mean, that I think is changed a lot since when I was writing about her in the 150 years ago. I think she would be pleased and made to learn that sign language has since the 60s also been understood by linguistic experts to be full languages on par with spoken languages. I think in the 19th century and the early 20th century, sign languages just weren't recognised in that way. And actually after Bell, the movement of oralism took root. And I really wrote this story at a turning point in history when oralism really was starting to pick up speed. An attitude towards sign language became incredibly negative, and I think it's hard to overstate just how negative. They were banned in schools for most instances. So lots of deaf people didn't have access to, their own language. And, I think so Ellen will be very pleased to see where we are now, but it's across a big sort of chasm of history, from when I wrote that story and the attitudes that have developed since in the 20th century.
Totally. And I wanted to actually speak about one of my favourite relationships in the book, and that is between Ellen and Frank. And that really showed me the importance of the deaf community, finding members of the deaf community and being able to share their own language. It was so beautiful to witness their kinship unfold, and I was really rooting for them. What was it like to create their dynamic?
I'm really glad you enjoyed that relationship, because I loved writing about them, and I still feel sad not to be on the page with them sometimes, writing about them. But I was actually first a little cautious about creating a romance, because I think it's really hard to do well. But because this is a book about the telephone and communication, and I was always wanting to probe that idea of connection, and I wanted Ellen to discover what meaningful connection was for her, rather than having to sort of patch up faulty ones all the time, a bit like Belle was doing with the telephone in the early days. And I really like your word kinship. I think I've experienced that myself with my deaf friends and family. I have some deaf family members, and that sense of kinship that comes from sort of sharing a particular experience that most people don't have. And so I wanted to capture that between Ellen and Frank. And it was hard to do at times because they use sign language, and it's a challenge to write sign languages on the page because they're visual spatial languages. So I think that was one of the challenges of the book, but it was coming back to the idea of kinship and that sort of spark of connection that I guess is a theme throughout the book, really. But yeah.
Yeah, it was really beautiful, but I understand that it must have been difficult to recreate, like you said, the visuals of that. And I'm always talking on the podcast about adaptations of work. Would you ever like to see your book adapted?
Oh, I mean, it would be amazing, absolutely amazing, because I think, there's so much incredible theatre. I mean, films as well, but there's always been, and I think, the deaf community have a long history of theatre. And so, and that's a natural medium for especially sign language, for sign languages, so you can see it, the obvious. But so yeah, it would be wonderful to have an adaptation where the language, where it's visual. Yeah.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Amazing. Can I ask, because it always interests me, what your literary influences are?
They're quite varied. I mean, there's lots of historical fiction writers like Sebastian Barry, who write those sort of that I really love. I love the writer Marilyn Robinson, quite different from this, but she's always a sort of source of wisdom that I go back to. Lots of deaf authors, so Sarah Novick in the States, who wrote True Biz, Raymond Antrobus, poet in this country, who's written about deafness and poetry in his first collection, The Perseverance. I mean, they were really encouraging for me, because it was, I've been writing this book for a very long time, actually, and I think it was hard not to look around and not have that many examples of deaf characters in fiction or in any literature. And I think finding those books, there are a couple of other ones as well, was really important in writing this one for me.
Thank you for those. I'm going to add them to my wish list immediately. The last question that we like to finish episodes on is asking if you have any recommendations for us. So that can be anything from TV, film, podcasts, books.
I did want to recommend, so I have actually, going back to the first question, I have actually been working on an article about books by deaf authors, and I was revisiting the work of Louise Stern, who wrote 2 books around 10 years ago, and she's a native sign language user, and just writes so beautifully about the physicality and the way in which she sort of navigates a hearing world. So I was revisiting that and wanted to mention it because I think her work is brilliant. I went to see a captioned performance of The Witches at the National Theatre yesterday with my daughter, which I thought was great. I really enjoyed that too.
Amazing, thank you. I also want to ask what you've got coming up next, if we're allowed to know.
Do you mean sort of events wise or writing wise?
Anything.
I've got some festivals I'm really looking forward to. So I think, and I'm quite new to this. I've not done many events, being my first book. So I'm looking forward to those. I'm sort of just trying to create a bit of space to sort of focus on the second book as well. So it's about balancing those two things.
Very exciting.
Bye.
I will pop links in the show notes of this episode of any events that I can find that you've got coming up. And I will also pop a link in the show notes for the article that you mentioned that you've written.
Yes. I'll check. They're not out yet, but yes, they will be soon.
Oh, perfect. Okay, I'm excited. So thank you so much, Sarah, for coming on A Pair of Bookends and joining us today. Is there anywhere that our listeners can find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Do you want to pop those in the link as well? Or...
Amazing. I can do that. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And if you'd like to follow us on social media, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And Sarah, thank you so much once again for joining us. It's been such a treat to get to talk to you and to read your wonderful debut novel, A Sign of Her Own, which is out now.
Thank you very much.